One of our very, very most favorite guests that we have on this platform is my next guest, Helen Davis Chaitman. She is a nationally recognized litigator with a diverse trial practice in the areas of lender liability, bankruptcy, bank fraud, RICO, the Racketeering Act, professional malpractice, and trusts and estates. Among Helen's achievements are the following. Ms. Chaitman was named one of the nation's top 10 litigators by the National Law Review and Journal. Ms. Chaitman has authored the monthly newsletter, The Lender Liability Law Report, which is subscribed to by law firms and financial institutions throughout the United States. And in 2014, Helen, along with Mr. Gotthofer, began publishing their book, J.P. Madoff, The Unholy Alliance Between America's Biggest Bank and America's Biggest Crook. It is available on their website at jpmadoff.com. Now, since early 2009, Helen has been an outspoken advocate for investors in Bernard L. Madoff's Investment Securities LLC. She has lobbied in Congress on a pro bono basis for statutory changes to assure Madoff customers of the protections of the Securities Investors Protection Act. And she has testified twice before congressional committees on issues affecting securities investors. I encourage you to go to the website, JP Madoff, Madoff, jpmadoff.com. Helen, welcome back to the Operation Freedom Show and platform.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that wonderful introduction.
Well, thanks for all that you do for every American and for their financial and economic freedom, and by holding Wall Street's feet to the fire. Unfortunately, very few folks other than yourself have the courage to do so. Helen, this week, Bernie Madoff died. You had opportunities to get to know him, obviously, because as I mentioned in your introduction, you trying to, if you will, make things whole for his victims. Educate our listeners about your interactions with him and your take on him and his passing.
It's very interesting because I did not know Madoff before he confessed to operating this massive fraud on his clients. But in 2009, he confessed on December 11th, 2008. And in 2009, I happened to be walking down Lexington Avenue one day, and my cell phone rang, and the voice said, "Helen, this is Ruth Madoff." Now, I knew who she was, of course, but I had never met her. And I said, "Hi, Ruth, how are you?" She said, "I'm fine. Bernie wants to speak to you." And again, I had never met Madoff, and I was kind of surprised that he wanted to speak to me, but there had been a lot of activity where I was trying to protect the investors, and that had gotten a fair amount of publicity, so I guess Madoff learned who I was. And that was the beginning of a relationship that I established with Madoff. I visited him in prison a number of times. I deposed him in prison on three or four different days. And the interesting thing, the very sad thing about the fact that he died is he died without ever being able to disclose the truth about the fraud. When a man named Jeffrey Pickauer decided to go swimming when he was having a heart attack and he was found at the bottom of his pool, this was after Madoff had confessed, it came out that Jeffrey Pickauer, whom your listeners, I'm sure, have never heard of, was the biggest beneficiary of Madoff's crimes. Madoff's net worth, according to his bankruptcy trustee, was $125 million, which, of course, is a lot of money, but Jeffrey Pickauer's net worth, when he decided to go swimming when he was having a heart attack, was over $20 billion. And Madoff had told me that Pickauer was the mastermind of his fraud and was the primary beneficiary of it. And I wanted to depose Madoff on that subject because I thought it was terribly important for the whole world to understand what had happened here and how it was that Madoff was now the scapegoat, even though, it doesn't take a lot of intelligence to think, well, okay, we have two people who are profiting from a fraud. One has a net worth of $125 million, and another has a net worth of over $20 billion. Well, who's running the show? Obviously, the guy who took out $20 billion and So I made a motion to depose Madoff, and Pickhower's lawyers said to the bankruptcy court, don't let Helen Chaitman ask Mr. Madoff any questions about Mr. Pickhower or anything that could lead to his saying anything about Mr. Pickhower. And I turned to the trustee, who I thought wanted to have the truth come out. And sure enough, the trustee's lawyers said, we absolutely agree. Ms. Chaitman should not be permitted to ask any questions about Jeffrey Pickhower. And so on the several days that I was deposing Madoff, I was unable to ask him any questions about the person who he had told me was the primary instigator of the fraud and clearly the primary beneficiary of it. And it's hard for people who are not involved in the law, and particularly who haven't been involved in the total capitulation of the court system to Wall Street in the last 15 or 20 years, it's hard for people to understand that someone who's a judge, who's paid with taxpayer dollars, would take action to prevent the truth from coming out about a fraud that impacted over 60,000 people. And yet that's exactly what happened. And now Madoff is dead, and the truth will never come out.
So, Helen, who educate us about what else did Madoff say about Pickhower? Who was Pickhower fronting? Who was Pickhower fronting for that they didn't want anyone to go near Pickhower? Because there had to be somebody bigger beyond Pickhower who they were afraid if you got to Pickhower would then lead to Mr. Big or Miss Big or whoever.
I don't have the information. I have suspicions, but I don't have the information because I was never given access to Mr. Madoff to get his testimony, and I was never able to get documents which would support whatever he said. I do know that Pickhower, there's no question, I have seen the trustees' documents relating to Pickhower, some of them, and it was clear that Pickhower had a chief financial officer named April Froiling, and April Froiling would write a letter to Madoff which would say something like this. Last year, the such-and-such account earned $150 million. Please restate the monthly statements for all of last year and show a loss of $37 million. It's hard to believe, right? I mean, you'd think that person would go straight to jail.
Right.
And yet the government, in terms of even the prosecutors, because Pickhower was prosecuted, but the settlement that his widow reached was that he would pay back the $7.2 billion that he actually took out of Madoff, but he wouldn't have to pay back any interest on that money, any penalties. So he basically had an interest-free loan for 30 years of $7.2 billion. That's not bad. So you have to say, now, why would the government and the Madoff trustee, who's supposed to be ethical and representing the public and looking to reveal to the public what actually happened here, why would they align themselves with Pickhower's lawyers to conceal the truth? There's no explanation for it, except that there's something very deeply corrupt about the whole system.
Seems to me that Pickhower knew how to spread the wealth, right?
Pickhower knew how to spread the wealth, and he must have been doing something with it that governmental interests wanted to conceal, because, again, it was the trustee who's subject to the court. The courts didn't have to cater to Irving Picard's desire that Pickhower's crime should be concealed and that Madoff should not be able to testify about it. Why would a trustee take that position, and why would a court accept it?
Helen, did you ever ascertain any relationship between Pickhower and, let's just pick a bank, J.P. Morgan Chase?
Well, Pickhower didn't, to my knowledge, Pickhower did not have a direct relationship with J.P. Morgan Chase, but of course, the Madoff fraud was known by J.P. Morgan Chase because J.P. Morgan Chase was the bank at which Madoff centered his activity in the investment advisory business. He had a very big legitimate trading business that was handled by his sons, and that was done through Bank of New York. His separate business, which he himself owned and handled, was this investment advisory fraudulent business, and that was done through J.P. Morgan Chase. And in the 1990s, J.P. Morgan Chase recognized that that's the Madoff trustee, that Madoff was doing illegal transactions. I mean, laundering money to the tune of billions of dollars in the 1990s. And instead of closing his account, which they had a legal obligation to do, and reporting it to the federal government, they just met with him and said, don't do this. This isn't nice. And Madoff did nothing to clean it up, and they never closed his account. And, of course, the fact that Madoff did business with J.P. Morgan Chase enabled him to continue the fraud and to entice new victims, because people judge the legitimacy of a business naively by the kind of institution that the business does business with. So if people would assume that if you're a major customer of J.P. Morgan Chase, that you must be very clean and honorable. Well, of course, now we realize that it's probably the opposite assumption one should reach, but
folks, we're speaking with Helen Chaitman. Name of the book, J.P. Madoff, The Unholy Alliance Between America's Biggest Bank and America's Biggest Crook. Website, jpmadoff, madoff.com. Helen, what was your overall impression of Bernie Madoff? You dealt with him over a period of time.
Yeah, my impression of him was that he was a kind of run-of-the-mill fraudster. So often in my practice, I've met people, there are some people who are intrinsically honest. And then there are people who can't distinguish between honesty and dishonesty. And Madoff, there are a lot of people like that, particularly on Wall Street. And Madoff was like that. What distinguished Madoff was his relationship with J.P. Morgan Chase. And what's interesting about it is Madoff was not as big a crook as J.P. Morgan Chase, because J.P. Morgan Chase has pled guilty to 6 felonies just within the last 5 years. Major felonies. But they get a slap on their wrist, and then they continue on to the next felony. So, in the context of criminal conduct on Wall Street, Madoff is a big player, but he didn't have the protection that's built into the system. He didn't have the billions of dollars to buy the support of the government, of senators, of congressmen, through lobbyists, etc. He didn't have the protection that J.P. Morgan Chase is able to buy.
And Helen, when you look back, who do you believe was the person or persons most fearful about Bernie Madoff spouting out the details of the operation?
Well, I think that the Jeffrey Pickow's widow had a personal interest in it, and of course, she was a financial beneficiary of Pickow's crimes, and she was able to keep most of that money. In fact, all they had to do was disgorge the money they took out without interest, and they took it out over 30 years. And Pickhower was a very shrewd investor, and he took that money and invested it in other things and made a fortune. And he's never had to account for any of that. So he was certainly a big beneficiary. But I can't help but feel that there's somebody else. I can't help but feel that Pickhower's attorney's ability to prohibit me from asking questions which were in the interest of all of the victims, and for both the bankruptcy court and the district court not to permit me to take that discovery, is so hard to believe. But I don't know that that's just Pickhower. I think that there could be someone much more powerful even than Pickhower who great wealth and could certainly buy a lot of help. But I think that there must have been someone else behind this whole thing, and we'll never know, unfortunately.
You know, the person I keep thinking about, maybe I'm just wrong, Helen, but you know, the person that in our discussions over the years of who had to have been knowledgeable about what Madoff was up to and was making a huge amount of money off of them, both on the criminality side of it, was that benevolent individual who the media loves because he just cares so much and gives so much back, is the CEO of J.P. Morgan Chase, Jamie Dimon.
Well, that is true because, you know, when Jamie Dimon came to J.P. Morgan Chase, Bernie Madoff was keeping on deposit at the New York branch of J.P. Morgan Chase $3 to $5 billion. You know, I'm old enough to remember that there were advertisements in New York. If you open up a bank account at, you know, Flushing Savings and Loan, and you put in $10,000, you'd get a toaster. So what do you get if you put $3 billion into J.P. Morgan Chase?
Big toaster. Yeah, and you know, Helen, by way of history, you took the information about the nefarious relationship between Madoff and J.P. Morgan Chase, and you courageously brought it to a number of different courtrooms at the district level, at the appellate level, even tried to get it to the Supreme Court, and you brought documentation that J.P. Morgan had attested to about their criminal activity and had said, yeah, we were. You brought that to various judges, and tell me if I'm wrong, Helen, but the judges said, we just can't believe this information, even though J.P. Morgan attests to it. Am I wrong in my recollection of what you've presented before?
No, it's very funny because when I was filing a complaint on behalf of the Madoff victims against J.P. Morgan Chase, I relied almost entirely on a document that J.P. Morgan Chase had executed when they settled the criminal charges involving their dealings with Madoff with the Department of Justice. They agreed to a stipulation of about 25 pages of facts. And part of their plea deal was they paid a couple of $1 billion back, and they agreed that they could be tried for committing crimes if they ever deny the veracity of any of the statements in this stipulation. So I thought, fine, there was enough in that stipulation for me. Someone could be prosecuted clearly on it. So I had enough in that stipulation, which I annexed to the complaint, to back up everything that I was saying because they were admitting to it. And I filed the complaint not in New York because I felt the New York courts would not give me a fair chance. I filed it in Florida thinking that a lot of the Madoff victims were residents of Florida and that I would hope just for an objective view of the case. But I ended up with a judge who dismissed the complaint on the grounds that the allegations were too speculative, that it was patently incredible that J.P. Morgan Chase would have done the things that J.P. Morgan Chase admitted to in its stipulation with the Department of Justice. So it's just kind of fascinating. And then that decision was affirmed by the 11th Circuit with Court of Appeals. So, you know, it gets to the point where people aren't even embarrassed to take ludicrous positions. They're so determined to protect criminal bankers that they take positions which are really an embarrassment to this country. I, as a lawyer, am humiliated that there are judges who will take positions like this in order to protect a financial institution which is perpetrating crimes against Americans who've done nothing wrong.
And when you try to take this to the Supreme Court, they didn't want to hear it, did they? Did they, Helen?
No.
Yeah. Helen, you mentioned you had the opportunity to depose Madoff a couple, 3 times. You visit him in prison a number of times. Helen, what was the most surprising piece of information Madoff provided you in our last 2 minutes here, what was the piece of information he provided you when you went, what? Really? Bernie? What was the biggest piece of information that set your hair on fire?
Well, I asked him about his communications with the very senior levels of J.P. Morgan Chase, because it didn't make any sense to me that he couldn't slip under anyone's notice. I mean, he's keeping $3 to $5 billion on deposit in a bank, and he's supposed to be an investment advisor, putting money in the stock market for people. So obviously, J.P. Morgan Chase had to realize they were harboring and facilitating the crimes of a major financial criminal. And I asked him